So welcome. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. My name's Laura Raymond. I'm campaign director for the Alliance for Community Transit LA. We're one of the co-organizers of tonight's event. ACT LA, we're a coalition of 34 grassroots and policy organizations. We came together to fight for equitable development for LA's majority, who are workers and renters. Our member organizations organize community residents and do community-based development in neighborhoods across LA, from Thai-Town to Boyle Heights to South LA to Pacoima. As a coalition, we work to center the interests of communities of color and low-income residents as we create a more sustainable city. We're working to develop the city in a way that provides jobs, affordable housing, and community-serving infrastructure. We reject notions of development that would build a city of exclusion and luxury. So the idea to organize tonight's panel came after the devastating election of one of the country's most exploitative developers to the office of president. Soon after the inauguration, figures within the Trump administration, such as Steve Bannon, were positioning infrastructure as a potential signature win to establish themselves as a political force that can deliver. And it was not lost on us that yesterday, when Trump equivocated again on condemning white supremacists in Charlottesville, that he did it at a press conference announcing an executive order on cutting regulations for infrastructure projects. We know that our work for racial justice also needs to address our built environment. Here in LA, we live in a segregated city with extreme racial disparities that have roots in a history of land dispossession, redlining, and at times mass evictions of people of color in order to build the city's infrastructure. Today, present-day investment often excludes or uproots the communities that we organize with. Those of us active around city planning and development policy have an important role to play in the era of Trump. This is a critical time to be charting out a different approach with all of you and our visionary panelists. So again, thanks everyone for coming here tonight, and thanks to everyone around the country. We're live streaming, so welcome to everybody that's tuning in. And before we introduce our panelists, we have a special guest to start us off tonight. We're honored to be joined by Julie Chavez Rodriguez from the office of Senator Kamala Harris. Julie is the state director for Senator Harris, serving as the senator's principal representative among constituents and elected leaders throughout California. Previously, Julie was the special assistant to President Obama and senior deputy director of public engagement at the White House. She was born and raised in California's Central Valley and worked for the Cesar E. Chavez Foundation in Los Angeles prior to joining the Obama administration. So thank you for being here, Julie.
Thank you, Laura, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Pastor. I know we've had the opportunity to work together over several years, and really excited to be back here and to be able to continue the work in California. I, like many of you all, are excited to get to the panel, and so I'll keep my remarks sort of brief, but just wanted to touch on a couple of things that I think are particularly timely for today's conversation, given sort of the renewed interest of the Trump administration to really look at an infrastructure package. So as you all know and have seen, right, we had no real grace period coming into office as the newest senator from the state of California, and so we've definitely had to hit the ground running. And the senator has had some really important committee assignments that are relevant to, as we think about and sort of connect with, ensuring that we are investing in our communities and protecting our communities, that give her an opportunity to really hold this out-of-control administration accountable on a number of different fronts, given the devastating impact that we've already seen from the long 8 months of this administration. So one, her jurisdiction over Homeland Security has really put her in a position to hold Trump's deportation force accountable, to find ways to continue to defend DACA, to work on cases, individual cases around deportation, and also now, working on a bipartisan way to hopefully get the DREAM Act passed. She's also on the Budget and Intelligence Committees, and so which we know are vitally important given the anemic budget we saw coming out from Trump that we know would cut basic social services in communities to their bone, especially for some of the most vulnerable members of our community, children, seniors, veterans, the homeless, domestic violence survivors, and others. And so, these committee assignments, again, are critically important, but the one I think that's most relevant for today is really the conversation about, or her committee assignment on the Environment and Public Works Committee. So in this role, she has, I think, a leadership opportunity to think about how we approach infrastructure and infrastructure investment and community development in much more holistic ways that are from a values-based perspective. And I know a lot of the conversation we're going to hear from the panel is really being able to lift up what are some of these successful models of practice that we can think about replicating in our state or in other places across the country, especially at a time when we know that there's not going to be a lot of federal legislative action on these issues. How do we actually begin to replicate these at a local level and create a groundswell that will force federal action once we have a much better administration and Congress in office? But I think, one of the important things that came out of the last administration that it looks like will continue and that I think is really central to the conversation is looking at federal investments from a place-based perspective and not looking at sort of, education funding over here and housing funding over here and transportation funding over here, but really looking at how do those things intersect because we know that that's how our communities work and function and are sort of the daily, heartbeat of these areas. And so the promise zones became one sort of effective tool for being able to do that. Unfortunately, Los Angeles has 2 designations for promise zone areas. And at least what we're hearing, and maybe you all are hearing more, all indications are that the federal government is going to continue to honor those promise zone designations for federal funding kind of moving forward, which are significant. But with this place-based approach, we also believe that there's a lot more that could be done to effectively address issues of concentrated poverty and what I think will be more part of the conversation today of structural racism that we see within policies at the federal level that are impacting the ways in which local communities can develop, grow, and be able to realize some of these federal investments. And so when we think about kind of the physical infrastructure, I think it's important that we understand it is a real backbone of our economy. It's not just about a vehicle for creating jobs, which I will talk about right now, but it is it impacts how we get to work, the cost of our food, the size of our water and sewer bills, and so much more. And so the availability of quality, equitable infrastructure at every level and within these communities are critically important. And so to really be able to show that we are not just making these sort of critical investments for the short term, but that we're actually looking at that kind of community reinvestment over the long term. And I think despite the importance that we've seen around this, there hasn't been enough investment. I think it's $1.6 trillion is what the current estimates are for what sort of our physical infrastructure needs here to get things into the state of good repair. But yet we're not willing to kind of take those steps. But I know, again, as we're looking at this conversation from a federal perspective on infrastructure, I know that Senate Republicans are looking at putting together their package, and so Senate Democrats have also put forward a blueprint to rebuild America's infrastructure that will focus on a 21st century transportation network, rebuilding waters and schools, helping to make the electric system stronger and strengthening the grid and making communities more resilient. The blueprint at this point proposes 15 million new jobs with the focus on job creation in some of the hardest hit industries that haven't been able to really bounce back from the recession. And so as we start to think about these sort of investments in physical infrastructure and public transportation, I think it's important that we do so in a way that is, again, looking at lifting up communities. focusing on the important, models that have come out of local hiring and local hiring provisions for new infrastructure spending and investment. So that we see the kind of important, benefits for local communities from good paying, middle class jobs, and also the additional kind of revenue and consumer spending that happens as a result of these good paying jobs coming into the local economies. I think also by, making sure that we're keeping an eye out and protecting some of the important labor and worker provisions like Davis-Bacon provisions to ensure that these remain good paying middle class jobs, because they're not, they didn't just sort of happen to be good paying jobs. It took a lot of hard work and, fighting and organizing on the part of labor to ensure that these were, jobs that could be and could remain sort of, important, economic opportunities for these communities. And I think the last thing that we want is to find ourselves, in creating another kind of system where we're, engaging in backbreaking labor for, low wages that we're not going to be able to really build a strong kind of domestic workforce for. And I would just say, additionally, I think being able to watch out for some of the environmental concerns that we know this administration is likely going to use infrastructure to really roll back. So things like the environmental protection standards and the Endangered Species Act and other things that we know they're looking at trying to use infrastructure as a way to gut and roll back some of these efforts that have been critically important to our communities. And then I would just say lastly, being able to understand that we need to, not just in this infrastructure package, make sure that we're able to get important provisions or maintain and protect important provisions, but also that we need to look at, sort of this upcoming budget fight in these next 30 days. We're going into another kind of battle, and so we need to make sure that we're maintaining levels of funding for HUD, for public housing, and for addressing issues of homelessness. That we're, our budget is making investments that are continuing to support workforce development programs. I know that the proposed budget cuts for things like the Department of Labor were 20%, which I can't even imagine what that would even look like and how that would impact individual communities. Really being able to engage in critical conversations like the future of work, because we know the impact of modernization and automation oftentimes are impacting some of these lower wage sort of labor force, or eliminating entirely, some of these middle class or what have been, long-term middle class jobs in some of these sectors. And so really being able to think about upskilling and retraining in advance of industries becoming obsolete as we're seeing technology change the kind of face of work today. And then lastly, we need to do this in the context of the real understanding of what the community, who the community is, what the community needs, what the histories of these communities are, and ways in which we can help to make sure we're building on those histories and not completely denying these communities and these individuals of sort of the future opportunities that they deserve. And especially at a time and in light of what we saw and what we've continued to see in the context of increased sort of hate violence and speech and bigotry at all new, in new ways and at the highest levels of government. I think it's critically important that the community engagement and community and cultural sort of relevancy of our work is as strong as possible and is at a core to who we are. And I know that some people were shocked, to my surprise, by what a lot of the events in Charlottesville, but I think what we're going to hear today from the panel and the conversation that I'm really excited to listen to and to be a part of, I think just exemplifies that there is a real undeniable reality that lurks in this country. That is not just, sort of hate in the hearts of some, but has been institutionalized in policies that we need to think critically about, that we need to work to address, and that we need to find a path forward, not just for our communities here, not just for the state of California, but I really think for the country. So thank you all so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Julie. So on behalf of ACT LA, I wanted to thank USC's Program on Environmental and Regional Equity, PERE, for co-hosting this event with us and making this great space available to everyone. PERE is an invaluable asset to the movement for equity in Los Angeles, so if you're not familiar with their work, definitely check them out. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Manuel Pastor, who's our moderator tonight. He's the director of PERE. He's also a professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. And in addition to directing PERE, he directs USC's Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, CSII. His research generally focuses on issues of economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movement seeking to change those realities. So without further ado, here's our panel.
Thank you. So I normally like to start a panel with a hilariously funny joke. And one might be, why is everyone sitting on that side of the room? So I think that's really probably worth someone doing a dissertation on that topic, although I think it's comforting for everyone in this room to be on the left. That does make us...
Our left, but they're right.
Yeah, but it's my perspective that counts. Thank you, Madeline. But I actually wanted to start instead with a moment of silence for the victims when it died of the racist violence in Charlottesville, but also so many victims of racist violence, including at the hands of the police, that have marked us, that cause us to grieve, that cause us to scream for change. So let's take a minute. So you might wonder why start there. It's of course the time that we're in, but it's also a connection that we're going to try to make tonight. Because I think, as Julie said, when we tend to think of, maybe not in this room, but so many people think of white supremacy, they imagine the neo-Nazis, they imagine the KKK, they don't think about the structural violence that is built into the system of racial inequity in the United States. They don't think about the system of over-incarceration. They don't think about the way in which infrastructure is laid out in a racially disparate way to provide opportunities for one group of people and deny opportunities and put in environmental hazards in other communities. So we're going to try to make that connection tonight. And I wanted to, or was asked to kind of frame this, but I'm going to be like Julie, I'm going to try to be quick because, man, the star power on this panel, damn. That's the reason why there's so many folks here. But one of the things that's clear is that as the Trump administration continues to sink further and further in terms of its approval ratings, et cetera, the one issue that may find itself feeling like it can make some progress on, because the healthcare battle got stuck. I think the tax battles may have problems, that they may find that they want to move forward on infrastructure spending. Yet the Trump approach is about privatization and not about creating public space. It pays no attention to local hiring or racially equitable hiring, and it pays even less attention to the consequences of gentrification that can result if you do infrastructure without planning for people not to be displaced and to be able to become part of whatever good develops from it. At a national level, then, we need to spotlight bold ideas, progressive ideas, radical ideas on infrastructure and transit. And the reason why is because while we may have many good progressive Democratic senators, including Kamala Harris, we will only get them, we run the risk of a lot of bad bipartisan agreements unless we really anchor a more progressive part of the debate. So we need to do this for a national level. More immediately, we here in Los Angeles are about to spend, on top of the $40 billion we already committed, $120 billion on transit expansion, and there's an estimated 500,000 jobs to be created over the next 40 years. At the same time in LA, we've got a planned expansion of the nation's largest jail system, a steadily worsening housing crisis with high unaffordability and a large homeless population. We have a chance and really an obligation to get this right locally and to demonstrate to the rest of the country what we can do when we're willing to spend the money the right way. Third, we have a special responsibility here to break silos. Sometimes when people think about infrastructure, they don't think about all the aspects of infrastructure. They don't think about education. They don't think about the jobs. They don't make the connection to incarceration. And so we have an opportunity in Los Angeles to break these silos. And I think we actually also have a particular moment now nationally, because I do think that the conversation is going to open up away from just these vicious acts of white supremacy to understanding how it gets baked into an economic system, a social system, and a political system. We have an opportunity to open up that conversation, to break the silos, to make people understand the connections between a vicious ideology and a system that also underdelivers. Finally, infrastructure creates an opportunity for us to build social movements that build ties. Because we can take people who are working on transit, people who are working on housing, people who are working on public health, people who are working on environmental justice, people who are working on de-incarceration, and make the links. So as much as our movement building can create a different and better and more optimal kind of infrastructure, the struggle for infrastructure can help us link together social movements that have sometimes thought about themselves as operating in different spaces. So what we have tonight is the total all-star panel to discuss that. When I got approached by ACT LA to be part of this, I said, fine, we'll support it. Why don't you go get some good speakers? I didn't think they would get this good of speakers, so I'm a little bit in awe. So I'm going to introduce them briefly, and if you don't mind, I'm going to introduce you in the order in which at least I indicated you would speak. Hope that's what you thought. So first we have my good friend Angela Glover Blackwell. She's the Chief Executive Officer of PolicyLink up in Oakland, but they've really got national prominence. As she was mentioning to me on the way in, I think it was 10 years ago, you started a center on infrastructure and equity, not realizing that it would catch on like it has. Many of you know her from her performances on various television shows and her speeches. She is also the co-author of a great book called Uncommon Common Ground, Race in America's Future. I know it's a good book because I'm her other co-author. And as we often joke, it's about to be made into a major motion picture, so we're very excited about that. Let's welcome Angela Glover Blackwell. She will be followed, she's going to give kind of a national picture on what we mean by equity and infrastructure. She's going to be followed by one of our local sheroes, Madeline Janis, who's the Executive Director of Jobs to Move America, an organization she helped to found in 2013. Most of you know her from her previous job as National Director ED of the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy between 1993 and 2012. Prior to that, she was executive director of the Central American Refugee Center, which is where we first got to know one another. We were both 12 at the time. But I can't think of anybody who's done more to change the economic and labor community kind of connections within Los Angeles than my good friend Madeline Janis. Let's give her a great welcome as well. She is going to be followed by Isela Gracian from the East LA Community Corporation. And they've been doing just tremendous work on development and understanding the connection between that and organizing. She started as the director of community organizing. She is now the president, was previously the vice president of operations. She's been making a mark for herself as an authority in Los Angeles on equitable community development and anti-displacement, and she and I have been on nearly every panel together for the last couple of years, so please welcome my good friend, Isela Gracian. And she doesn't need too much of an introduction to all of you, but Patrisse Cullors, who's an artist, organizer, and freedom fighter. She's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. She is the director of Dignity and Power Now, which is doing tremendous work both against incarceration and then helping with the process of reintegration, and in particular with the spiritual work of healing. That's also an important part of making people whole. She has more awards and a longer bio than any human being should probably have. But I do want to say two things. First, she's from the San Fernando Valley, so she's a Valley girl made good.
Right. Valley girl, too.
And amongst her many awards that she got just this last year, my favorite was from DLG Media, which gave her an award for being a kick-ass woman of color. So let us give a big warm welcome to Patrisse. So they each have 7 minutes to present initially, and then I'll follow up with some Q&A. If you want to ask a question, there's going to be some cards that'll be circulating. People will be circulating them. We're going to ask you to write them down. We'll try to collate them so that they're questions. Each of them has 7 minutes. When you're about to hit 7 minutes, I'm going to raise one hand, indicating it's about time for you to stop. If you keep on going for too long, I'm going to raise 2 hands. That is a signal to the audience to thunderously applaud whatever point you were making, because surely it was your last. So with that threat, let me begin with my good friend, Angela Glover Blackwell.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? It's such an honor to be on this panel with all of you, and I am thrilled to be in Los Angeles. I live in Oakland, California, but I care deeply about what happens in California, and what happens in LA determines what happens in California. So I am happy to be here. PolicyLink, the organization that I lead, is a research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. The lifting up what works part is really important to us because we believe that you can show anybody a problem in this nation, and we can show you a place where community residents and local leaders are coming together and they're coming up with solutions. The issue is we're not translating those solutions into policy, so we're creating platforms that we can stand on. So we try to lift up what works and get it embedded in policy. Early on, we recognized that infrastructure was really important for advancing equity. It came to us because we began to work in New Orleans after Katrina in 2005. And working there, we saw what happens when infrastructure fails, and we saw all of the money that was pouring in, and is still starting to pour in those areas, that could be used to achieve so many things. And it was so important for us to think beyond just rebuilding the levees, but to think about how do you actually connect a community. And so when we had a national summit on equity in New Orleans in 2008, we launched the PolicyLink Center for Infrastructure Equity. And there were things that we were thinking then. We were thinking that equity, that infrastructure investments are so important for connecting to jobs, connecting to opportunities to improve your health and well-being, not just health care, but fresh fruits and vegetables, places to exercise. So important for being able to stay connected to cultural and faith institutions. So important for everything that we think about. I remember long ago, I lived in LA many, many years ago, before any of you were even a thought. And at that time, I was lucky enough to get a job interview. I lived in the Crenshaw area, and I got a job interview in Watts. I was looking for a job that was doing something to advance Black Power movement. And so I moved to LA from New York. I went through the yellow pages and looked for things that started with Black or national or something that would make me think this was, and I finally got an interview. Didn't have a car, so I planned the bus route. I called the bus station and found out how to go. 5 buses. I allotted an hour and a half to take those 5 buses. 2.5 hours later, 4 buses completed, 1 more to go. I turned around and came back home because it was after the interview, defeated. Just a personal example of how important infrastructure investments can be. We think that when we're thinking about infrastructure, we should be actually applying the equitable development model. And the equitable development model says, just as we were hearing, integrate people in place. Don't do the transportation and other issues having to do with design over here, and then think about the things having to do with people over there. Integrate them together. Think about those investments in a way to reduce disparities. The disparities that exist in this nation, the notion that where you live is a proxy for opportunity. You tell me your address and I can tell you way too much about you, including how long you'll live, that is so repulsive. And yet we're not thinking about how to reduce those disparities when we're thinking about infrastructure investments. We need to be driven by that. We need to understand that it's an opportunity for triple bottom line results, economic returns, but what about returns for the planet, and what about returns that actually advance equity? And one of the most important elements of equitable development, it must be done in complete concert with the people whose lives are going to be impacted by the decisions. Engagement and power and decision-making at every level. Now, when you think about the issues that we're facing today, it turns out that what all of you have been concerned about, and all of us have been concerned about, the equity and inclusion and justice agenda, has become the only agenda to be concerned about. LA, Oakland, California, long time ago, we became cities and a state in which the majority were people of color. It's happening in the whole nation. As we think about that, and we look at how people who are of color are being disproportionately left behind, it becomes very clear that being able to pursue strategies that allow all to participate, prosper, and reach their full potential has become a national imperative. Therefore, we have to think about how we advance that agenda with every dollar that we spend. Too often we lay out the problem and feel that we have been successful when we're able to get a program for $100 million or even a program for $1 billion. The truth of the matter is the big money is getting spent on things like infrastructure. And if that is the national imperative, infrastructure dollars have to advance that imperative. A couple of places where that's happening, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Minneapolis, St. Paul, a community that was not as connected as it could be. They were going to build a light rail line connecting the two, going down a main artery. And in the initial planning, they were going to spend billions of dollars and bypass low-income communities of color, particularly the Black community. The community organized. They were able to file litigation. They worked with the people who were doing this, and they were able to redo the whole thing, change where the stops would be, help the of-color entrepreneurs to be able to fully participate, make sure that they had a different model for how to be able to assess infrastructure, not just thinking about safety and things like that, but thinking about the equity agenda. The result of that is that they have been able to make a tremendous difference in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I'm going to give you one other example in 30 seconds, and that is in Washington, D.C., where they have been looking at how not looking. They have been making plans in the District of Columbia to do something about their water and sewer system. And in doing that, they focused on procurement, because not only are there jobs, not only are there stops, not only are there all those issues, but a lot of money gets spent contracting and procurement. Well, they came up with a strategy to make sure that people of color and women could participate, and the result was that over $99 million, 36%, was awarded to minority firms, and $17 million awarded to firms that were headed by women. And so what we have here, he hadn't raised his hand yet, what we have here is an example of when you pursue strategies and you focus on those who are most vulnerable, you benefit everybody, because all these resources coming into communities increase the economic vitality of a community. I call it the curb cut effect. You all know those curb cuts. They're in the street, and they're at every corner, and they're there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs. But how many times have you seen people pushing a stroller, helped by that? How many times have workers had their burden lightened with carts and wagons and pulling and pushing? How many times have we seen people be able to, how many times have we seen people find the corner to cross the street? 9 out of 10 unencumbered adults cross at the corner because of curb cuts. Think how many lives that has saved. The lesson from that is that when you solve problems for those who are most vulnerable with specificity and targeting, you benefit everybody. Thank you.
So Madeline, you're next.
Okay. So I have PowerPoint that I'm going to easily get through in 7 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to talk, so I now run a national nonprofit organization called Jobs to Move America, as Manuel mentioned, and we are proudly involved in the coalition here and doing a lot of work with LA Metro and our build out. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the dueling visions for infrastructure that both Manuel and Angela were talking about, and then go into some of the history, particularly racist history, of federal grant rules around infrastructure that we've just released a report around, as some context, important context for then how do we move our agenda forward. So I am, oh good, okay. All right, so just, I think sometimes we don't, kind of put our dueling visions out there. We let the right define our agenda, and then we come back with issues. So we really have to start putting our ideas together. So the right has done a very good job of putting the vision for infrastructure, and I call this the Trump Corporate Infrastructure Program. And basically the idea is funnel hundreds of billions of dollars into the private sector and trust the free market. And that means privatize as much as possible. It means that public information is covered by trade secret protection, so nobody gets to know what they do. Environmental rules are an additional burden, and no conditions, no strings, no requirements or incentives. Cheapest is best. That is a framework that's been developed over 40 years, and that's what's right now ruling the roost in the federal investment in infrastructure. So I just want to counterpose a vision, and there's a great document that I saw that Manuel had worked on. But just to kind of simplify, our vision, infrastructure is essentially a new deal for Los Angeles. And I'm focusing this on Los Angeles, but it could be a new deal for the country. Major public investment in infrastructure is ruled by public control, public purpose and control, by a concept we're calling inclusive public procurement, which means a lot of things we can talk about, and where it's equitably and sustainably designed. So all of those, kind of the key principles of infrastructure as a new deal. And this means good jobs and equity is built in, baked in. There's open government and transparency, so we know what we're getting as taxpayers. Sustainability and climate protection are also baked in. And we think about healthy communities as we build out the system. So with that in mind, I just want to call out public procurement, because public procurement is something that many of us have seen as kind of a wonky thing that governments do that we don't really understand. But actually, public procurement is a $2 trillion a year endeavor. And 2/3 of that is state and local governments, and 1/3 of that is federal government procurement. And if you think about infrastructure spending as a whole, 30% of that money stays with public agency, but 70% goes right out the door through this process that's called procurement, which is basically public purchasing. So if you think about 12% of GDP is on public procurement, this can be an incredibly important tool. However, over many years, the right has really understood this and has, especially at the federal level, put in place some serious obstacles to achieving this kind of return on taxpayer investment that that I was talking about as kind of the dueling frame. We just released a study, and we have a summary version that's at the table for anybody who wants, that we call Reagan v. Cities, the 20th Century Battle Over South African Apartheid and Lessons for the Trump Era. And what the basic rule of thumb is that all the problems that many of us have faced over the years with the prohibition against local hire, the prohibition against cities using federal dollars to do progressive things, it all dates back to the Reagan attack on cities and states that adopted anti-apartheid sanctions laws. And so I want to give you just a tiny little history lesson here, and then bring that back to how do we counter this? How do we, call racism and basically a spade a spade? So, for those of you who, again, were not a twinkle in anybody's eye, apartheid in South Africa had existed for hundreds of years, but it was institutionalized and codified into law in 1948. And under this system, and a lot of people look at other parts of the world and think about apartheid now as really a noun, but non-whites were unable to vote. They lacked any semblance of economic mobility or educational opportunity. And the important thing is that US businesses own billions in assets and were working directly with the South African government to defend those assets. And this is not from time of slavery. This is from, in our lifetimes. For example, anyone disobeying these laws will be imprisoned, fined, and or whipped. Okay, so we had an incredible movement that, I think Angela and I had the benefit of learning from. And so the anti-apartheid movement focused on adopting local, state, and then in Congress eventually sanctions, which were basically prohibitions on doing business, awarding contracts, or giving funding to companies that were invested in South Africa. And as you can see from this map, by 1991, this was an incredibly successful movement. Now, the Reagan administration, and we detail this in our study, adopted 4 main tactics. And if you read this list of tactics, sound familiar. I think probably you might think about some of the tactics that this current administration is using to attack cities and states. Adopting national policy, collaborating with the business lobby to oppose, you could call sanctions sanctuary, couldn't you? Now here, interpreting federal law to justify withholding federal funding from cities and states adopting sanctions or threatening to withhold it, and then actively organizing support for litigation. So I'm going to focus just for my last minute or two on this threat to withhold federal funding and how it was used during the anti-apartheid era, the Reagan era, and how it's been institutionalized since then. New York passed a law, a sanctions law, and the Reagan Justice Department found that, and we have discovered that they basically made up this interpretation. It wasn't based on the law, but they said that these sanctions laws would be a burden on competition, so that if any city adopted these sanctions laws, they would lose their federal funding. And it was later institutionalized. This had long-lasting impacts. These are some of the things that this rule has prohibited over the years, everything from local hire to anti-slavery disclosure requirements to disadvantaged DBE requirements. And finally, I just want to say that because of a lot of the work that all of us are doing, thank you. I'm trying not to talk too fast because you can't get it all in. So this exists, and people in the Obama administration, and I saw Therese McMillan here, who's now at LA Metro, was one of the people who led this fight during the Obama years to create workarounds so that we could do, if we couldn't do local, do local hire, we could do construction careers policies, we could do a U.S. employment plan around manufactured goods, we could do all kinds of things around equity and get around this historical rule. And therefore, we have a lot we can do and a lot to fight for. And so I'm looking forward to talking more about our program and how we lead the country in Los Angeles.
Great, thank you. On the way to Isela, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is I want you to take note that Angela managed to say that Los Angeles was sort of the center of the world, which was a very politic thing from somebody in the Bay Area to say. So very, very good. And don't you feel smarter already? Particularly this last piece. And I also wanted to mention with regard to that my wife and I actually met through the anti-apartheid movement. So not only did we push aside a racist regime, but it's been very, very good to me. So, Isela.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you to ACT LA staff for pulling this panel together and this opportunity. I actually want to start off acknowledging, because we're talking about infrastructure and the different connections, that educational institutions are also part of infrastructure, and that we're at USC, which has been an institution that has really driven displacement and gentrification around the area and residents. And I just want to give a quick shout out to the Unidad Coalition that has really led the way around holding USC accountable on those issues. So thank you all for that work. Mic holder. Here, actually, I'll hold it instead of trying to crouch down. So for East LA Community Corporation, we started in the mid-90s in Boyle Heights, and our 4 founders were really looking at, we're having conversations around the LA uprising and the riots, and what role could they play on the east side around these issues, and how could they really have an impact in their neighborhood. And they landed on that we needed to have a development organization, but that we couldn't just build housing, that we also had to build power, community collective power, in order to have transformative change. So our organization builds affordable housing, we do community organizing, and our third piece is building financial capacity for our residents to be able to engage and sustain in the economy. The pictures behind me are not going to follow what I say, so hopefully it's not a distraction to you. But one of the important things that these pictures are going to show you is who fights for the affordable housing, what affordable housing looks like, and who lives in the housing that we build and the communities that we work in. It was important for me to share these images because a lot of the challenges that we face when we're talking about our developments and our engagement process are comments about not having these people continue to be our neighbors. My staff was at a community meeting at a neighborhood council, and when they came back, their feedback was it felt that they were in the middle of a Trump rally, hearing the comments that people were making around these people that could potentially be their neighbors, and actually that are their neighbors. So keep that in mind as you're seeing these images behind us. So in LA, around gentrification, housing is a big linchpin because we need to be able to live in a place in order to be able to stay in place. The LA Times has been covering this a lot, and in June, Steve Lopez wrote an article, and I'm just gonna read one sentence that simplifies the issue that's very complex, right? Rents have risen while pay remains flat. The homelessness population is growing, and folks consider themselves fortunate to live in a car, right? Just in the last year, we've seen an increase of 23% in our neighbors that have lost homes, that have become homeless. And in LA, 2 million households pay more than 30% of their income to rent. That means that we have 20 million neighbors at risk of becoming homeless, right? So although we're working on a lot of issues to end homelessness, we're seeing the numbers go up instead of down. And our dialogue here in LA around the affordable housing crisis is focusing on production, right? But we know we can't rely on the trickle-down theory to be able to provide housing for the most in need. We know that we can't rely on the market alone to fill that need. And more importantly, we know that we can't do business as usual in order to work on those numbers and be able to provide homes to our neighbors. So supply is important. We do need to build. That's one of the strategies that we do at ELAC. But we cannot rely on supply alone, because it's like putting water in a bucket that has holes, right? Like if we keep losing water and putting water in, we're never gonna get to fill the bucket with water. So it's important to have protection, preservation, and production when we're talking about housing and being able to protect our neighbors from homelessness and be able to get those neighbors that are without a home to be in a home. In Boyle Heights, in one of the neighborhoods we focus in 2006, we started raising the issues of gentrification and displacement. Although the news would have you think that it just started a couple years ago, maybe a couple months ago. But you know, one of the reasons why Boyle Heights gets so much attention is because we've been implementing interventions for some time now, right? Our organization, our partners around land use and planning, affordable housing, new schools, youth investment, all these different strategies that can help improve a neighborhood and have people stay in place. So there's a big question in Boyle Heights: which way is it going to swing? You know, is it going to fully gentrify? Are we going to have the right balance of accountable development, of development without displacement? And that's why it's such an important neighborhood, not only for LA, but for the whole country that is facing these pressures of housing. So as we worked on these issues, we started looking at that we needed to have a citywide approach, because we couldn't go to every single neighborhood that's being impacted by these issues. And we're one of the founders of ACT LA, and we started looking at this piece of equitable TOD. And when we started working with ACT LA, we had an opportunity to look at the intersections of housing and how we prioritize extremely low income, transit, and looking at all the parts of mobility and jobs, and having quality jobs and union jobs. And we saw an opportunity with JJJ, and we're really proud to have been part of being able to pass that here in Los Angeles, where we have a strong component of transit-oriented communities, where we're working to connect people to places that are affordable, diverse, and inclusive. So we need to do things different, not business as usual. And sometimes that means going back to roots and trying tactics that maybe we've done before, but the environment wasn't there yet for those to be successful. And one of the pieces that we're uplifting at ELAC is being able to use arts and culture as a way of being able to go back to those ideas. But I want to make sure that folks think about arts and culture differently. This is not just an ornament that you listen to or that you see on a wall. Arts and culture is about a process. It's about being able to utilize that to spark imagination, to break through roadblocks, and more importantly, to have us experience the world we want to see, right? We need to be able to imagine and go beyond just the basics of home and food, and really be able to imagine the world with a true democratic process that really ends homelessness and provides homes for every single neighbor that we have. And we're utilizing that piece to be able to imagine and then enact that world that we see. And part of that is really, we need to address policies, but we also need to address the societal barriers that we have in being able to see these folks, because it's a lot of us, and see them as our neighbors, and be able to address racism, classism, and all the other isms that really keep people from saying, yes, I want this housing in my neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and that was just about when I was going to raise my hand, so perfect. So, Patrisse.
I think I'm going to do the same thing. Okay. Hey, everybody. Thank you, panelists. I appreciate being here. I love my city. My heart is heavy as I sit on this panel thinking about the state of this country and what we're up against. And so I'm grateful in these moments because I'm reminded how much powerful organizing and work is happening in the city and happening across the country. But I come with a heavy heart today. So I want to talk about prisons and jails as part of this conversation around infrastructure. And I grew up here in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley and Van Nuys for half my life, and then in Canoga Park for the other half of my life. And those are both mostly working class, poor areas, over-policed, with a lot of folks being ushered into juvenile halls and county jails and prisons. And I think for those of us who grew up in LA where that was our everyday, it impacts how you understand the world. It impacts how you understand the police's role in your world. And what I think has been important about this moment in the last 4 years that Black Lives Matter has been introduced to the world is that we've been able to unlock the conversation that Black communities, poor communities, and brown communities have been having a long time about policing, about the role of police that the rest of America wasn't thinking about, talking about, or often thought was hyperbolic, right? And so as we've seen the unfortunate videos be produced and shown to the rest of the world, many of us don't have to watch those videos because that's our life. And I think what's been most important for me in the work that I've been doing around challenging mass incarceration and challenging over-policing is that when you have a prison and a jail, you have to have a court. You have to have police and law enforcement. You have to have DAs. And so we've essentially created entire infrastructure to criminalize whole communities. And we've done it successfully. And the piece for me that has been really important over the last 34 years of my life is that we didn't, this has been an evolution. So we didn't start here. And for many of us who grew up during the war on gangs and the war on drugs, it's hard to believe that there is an LA that wasn't heavily policed, an LA that wasn't going to push forward a $3.5 billion jail plan. But we ended up here. And so how did that happen? How did we end up in a city that has decided that it's going to invest $3.5 billion in caging human beings? And part of the logic has been, it's simple. Every single person in this room and on this panel, we allowed it to happen. We allowed ourselves to believe in a criminal. We've allowed ourselves to believe that people who use drugs deserve to be in jails and prisons. We have allowed ourselves to believe in ideology about the people who we're supposed to love, about the people who are in our family, about the people who are in our community. And then we gave much of our agency over to law enforcement. And so we live in a moment when law enforcement isn't just policing communities, but they become the social workers of that community. They become the mental health providers of that community. And so think about all the times law enforcement has killed somebody. And then when you hear what the family says, oh, this person had bipolar disorder, this person had PTSD, this person was schizophrenic, and then you hear the number that half of the people who are killed by law enforcement actually have a known diagnosis. Or you hear the number that Los Angeles County Jail is the largest mental health provider in the world. Do y'all hear me? I know it's late, but come on, y'all. That means 1,400 people that have a known diagnosis are living inside of a cage. So the question becomes, how do we get out of this mess? What's the role of organizations? And for me, at this point, it can't just be organizations that are fighting mass criminalization. It has to be those of us who are fighting around the housing crisis. It has to be those of us that are fighting around job and employment. It has to be those of us that are educators. It has to be those of us that are working in art and culture work, because literally it took all of us to allow for this mess to happen. It's going to take all of us to undo the mess. And so for me, it's not just, for a lot of us, it's not just about talking about something that we are really passionate about. Our own loved ones' lives are at stake because of this county jail. And if we don't put all the organizing muscle behind it to stop the jail, in 10 to 15 years, we're going to allow for Los Angeles to be the #1 jailer in the world. And I think, as I do the work of organizing on a daily basis, both challenging our local government and also challenging our national government, I think about how much work it's going to take to really call for a divestment from law enforcement, a divestment from courts and jails and policing. And when we divest from something, we have to reinvest in something else. And so the call for divestment isn't just a call to abandon ship, it's actually a call to imagine something new. It's a call to allow for communities who've historically been marginalized, pushed out, humiliated, decimated, for them to have an opportunity, for us to have an opportunity to have access to healthy food, to have access to jobs and housing, to have access to shelter. And I think that this new call for many of us, especially those of us who grew up during the war on gangs and the war on drugs, this is our moment to challenge this administration. This is our moment to challenge local government. And I think that LA plays a particular role, because often what LA does, the rest of the country does. And if we can't change this place, then how are we going to change the rest of the world? But one, I feel excited about this moment. As much as my heart is heavy, I think we have an opportunity. And I think part of the opportunity is in these types of conversations and organizations and coalitions like ACT LA, where we can bring some of the best minds together to decide how we are going to recreate Los Angeles. A Los Angeles that I hope that my 16-month-old will be able to live in without being worried about being ushered into a cage.
Thank you very much. So I want to remind people that if you have a question, I think there's some index cards that are being circulated to write it down, and those will be brought up. But I'm now, for about the next 15 minutes, I'm going to pretend to ask questions. What I mean is that I'm going to ask questions, but these are such good speakers, they're going to take the material they didn't talk about and bring it in to answer the question I asked. So I know that already in advance. So, but I wanted to start with Angela, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to expand a little bit on what is innovative that's going on in the rest of the country. You talked about a few examples. I know PolicyLink has the opportunity to go in many different locations. So what's innovative? What's making the kind of linkages we're talking about in this conversation?
Well, I thank you for that. There are things that are happening that are innovative. I'll give you a few. I gave you a few. I can give you a few more. But the innovation that we need, we have not seen. Cleveland is doing something innovative. They're doing something around their Healthline bus rapid transit system. And what they're doing is making sure that that bus line really does serve the needs of the people who are there. Making sure that they have high frequency, 24-hour service that really does connect people to everything that we've been talking about. There is a community called East Cleveland, which is that's the low-income Black community. And of course, it's isolated from everything in terms of jobs. And so they're making that connection. And that's very good. But the reason I say we don't have the example that we need is that we just aren't operating at scale. We are not operating at scale. This notion that I introduced, lifting up what works, it is really based on the fact that there are elements of what works all over. What we've got to do is figure out how to, at the state level, get some things in place so that all that money that goes out from the states to communities is driven by the kind of equity agenda that we're talking about. Making sure that at the federal level, that you're not drawing down federal resources if you're not focused on the agenda that we're talking about. What they've been doing in Philadelphia around water, very exciting. They have taken the challenge of stormwater, sewage, runoff. This is happening all over the country. There are consent decrees all across America. Trillions of dollars will be spent. We need to make sure that you're not accessing those dollars if you're not thinking about the environment, if you're not thinking about the jobs, if you're not thinking about how to green communities, if you're not thinking about some of the issues that we've been talking about, people coming out or ought to be coming out of the criminal justice system, getting people ready to do those jobs. So there are wonderful examples, Manuel, all across the country. It is up to us to organize, flex our muscle, use our power, and make sure that we are applying the best that we have learned at the level of scale that it's going to take to get everybody participating and prospering, and we don't have forever to get that right.
Thanks. I wanted to ask Madeline a question. You talked about a New Deal, and while that term resonates, the New Deal was also racially exclusive, as you very well know, and have talked about yourself, in the way in which Social Security excluded domestic and agricultural workers, black and brown people, the way in which the home lending program essentially codified redlining. In fact, Ira Katz-Nelson wrote a book about the New Deal called When Affirmative Action Was White, because it was about affirmative action to launch a white working class into more job security. How do we not make that mistake? What do we need to do policy-wise and organizing to put racial equity as a key part of this infrastructure investments going forward?
It's a great question. And I think and I know there are very specific things that can be done, very, very specific things. And racial equity, racial justice has to be built into the DNA of the way the money is spent. And just to step back, I'm a lawyer by training, but I'm an organizer by spirit. But I know that the rules of the road matter. And a lot of times we don't think about the rules of the road. We just say, if we can get that money, out there, that, somehow it's going to turn into, the kind of jobs and fairness and lifting up that we expected when policymakers adopted or we fought for the money. And what I've tried to illustrate here a little bit is that the rules have been skewed against since the New Deal, since way before, since Reconstruction, since slavery. But there's a way to get to the detail, to the DNA, to the rules of the road, and that's how we spend our money. So we're talking about procurement, meaning contracting. We're talking about design. We're talking about all the implications of it. For example, in contracting, we have been advocating for something we call the U.S. Employment Plan, and we had to structure it that way because of these rules. But basically, when LA Metro spends its money on buying buses and trains and communications equipment and all those other things, that race and gender, or the best we can do in California, are directly taken into account. So when a $1 billion contract is on the street, then the bidders all have to say, well, how are you going to create good jobs? How are you going to create opportunity for historically excluded communities? How are you going to create pipelines for those communities? Same thing with construction careers policy. So when we actually think about and we advocate for racial equity being built into the DNA, and we understand the rules, I think we can do amazing things. And we can even demand that people with records be considered a disadvantaged category and be given first choice. That contractors say we, are required to hire 10% or 20% of their employees who have a record. So you can actually say, I have a record, so I can get special, go ahead of the line. So anyway, there are many ways to do it. The main thing that we need to understand is history, and that we need to be smart about the rules of the road and how we fight for the right ones.
So I have a question for Isela, and then actually two for Patrisse. So special. So for Isela, I guess I just have to ask, what about that coffee shop, man? I mean, what's wrong with Weird Wave? But I think there's, you and I were talking about this before, there's a real narrative about what's going on and the way it's being told in the press. But at the same time, that the narrative of the community really isn't breaking through. So what's going on? How do you make sure a community narrative breaks through rather than the sort of sense of resistance to progress?
Thank you. So for those of you that didn't get the why we're laughing, in Boyle Heights, and if you've seen the news, it's been covering groups of residents protesting a coffee shop by the name of of Weird Wave, and sorry.
I actually believe that's what they call it, a coffee shed. Yes.
Thank you. And what's been highlighted in the press and the conversations that have been taking place is that the group's efforts are misplaced and misfocused, and the conversation has shifted to for some residents of like protecting this coffee shop that maybe they wouldn't have even ever gone into, but now they've made it a point to go into because a group that's seen as too radical and too aggressive has targeted them unfairly. And prior to that, the group raised concerns around art galleries and protested the art galleries. What's also important to know about the narrative of Boyle Heights is that it's a neighborhood that was shaped by the intentional policies of disinvestment and not investing. And it was one of the neighborhoods that was most diverse in Los Angeles by the 1950s. But that was because people couldn't live in other places, right? It was because it was a very intentional, redlining where people could not get loans to buy properties. They couldn't get insurance for their properties. There's historical documents that specifically say that the government will not invest because of the cesspool of people that were living there. And that is in direct reference to the cultural diversity that existed at the time. So you have all this divestment, and although we had these horrible conditions, we're still surviving, right? We're still in, however you can imagine, in shapes or forms, thriving. And forced displacement, right? When our Japanese neighbors were ripped from their homes to internment camps, so this hasn't just been a natural cause of movement of people. So we have this history, and you also have a history of fighting, right? The Chicano movement, the educational justice fights, the Chicano blowouts, the mural movement, and you have a combination of a history of fighting and for these changes in your neighborhood, and you're seeing that your neighbors are not going to be there, that those people that fought to make all these improvements. I mean, in the schools in Boyle Heights, we are now close to a 70% graduation rate. How many people hear that in the news? Going from some of the lowest graduation rates. That has been because of people fighting for those same people that are challenging the galleries and the coffee shops. So I share this with you because I want us to be able to shift the narrative around how we see these radical groups, because there isn't anything radical about wanting your neighbors to be able to continue to stay in their neighborhood. There isn't anything radical about wanting to have homes for affordable homes for you and your family. And these solutions don't get uplifted in the press and in our conversations. So for me, when the press is calling about, like, hey, really what they're asking, like, what's the achievement between the groups, right? Like, what's going down? I'm like, I'm not going to engage in that conversation, right? Just yesterday, I was talking to the LA Times, and I was really excited because the reporter was actually asking about mariachis and musicians and what would be the impact to the neighborhood if we lost this cultural treasure, and how would that get passed on to generations if they no longer existed. So there is more complexities and nuances to what we see in the press, and in Boyle Heights. We need to be able to have a range of tactics and strategies in order, not just in Boyle Heights, but in all the neighborhoods, in order to truly advance the work and achieve neighborhoods that are inclusive and just for everybody.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to ask Patrisse 2 questions, and we got some great questions from the audience. Patrisse, what should all of us know about what are the most successful paths for reentry, for people exiting the system of over-incarceration? What do they need to have in place? You could talk a little bit about what Dignity and Power now is doing, but what do we need to know? What do we need to support? How do we build it into infrastructure generally?
I think some of the key impacts. Well, first we need to understand the impacts of incarceration on both people and the communities that they come from. And some of the most important impacts are impacts that have to do with people's mental health and the impact trauma has on folks who are incarcerated or coming home. And so incarceration changes you, and it changes your relationship to where you live. And so having holistic support systems to bring people home is key. And Dignity and Power now, although we're not a service provider, we understand that trauma happens to everybody, and that we have to create an organization that actually taps in people's resilience. And so we have both healing health and wellness director in our work, and we have art and cultural coordinators, where when people are coming home, we do a set of workshops both outside of the jails. So we're catching people when they're coming out and being released from county jails, but also we have training programs for people who are just getting out of prisons, both state prisons and county jails. And that was important for us when we were developing the organization, which is about 5 years old, because many of us, almost half of the staff, well, more than half of the staff is formerly incarcerated, and most of our membership is formerly incarcerated and or they're loved ones of people who are incarcerated. And what we realized was that there was a particular need to have people be able to share about the impact incarceration had on them, and have an organization that held that space versus just having people show up to county board of supervisor meetings and having to relive their trauma or talk about the experience that they went through in order to pass a policy, and then not having an infrastructure to help deal and heal with what that trauma brings up for people. So I think that's one. And that trauma is an obstacle. If you don't have healthy coping mechanisms, that's an obstacle to being able to have a job, let alone keep a job. So I think the other piece is living in a city that is invested in not having folks mark a checkbox, as in the box that says, have you committed a felony or not? And that is a key obstacle for folks being able to have employment. And so our city eventually still has it, but our city banning the box. And then I think the last piece that's important, folks who've been incarcerated have some of the highest, we have very high recidivism rates in Los Angeles and the state of California. And so how do we keep people from not going back? Our cities, our infrastructure isn't built for people to stay home and be home healthy. And so we have to actually be looking at bringing people back home and a model that's holistic and not just piecemeal.
That's fantastic. I know, Madeline, you want to say something about this as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example because sometimes we don't allow ourselves to think big enough in terms of what we need to demand. So I am a strong supporter of Ban the Box, but and we want to make sure that the huge corporations that are benefiting from spending $120 billion on expanding our infrastructure actually have to consider people who have records. So there's this one example in 2012. LA Metro gave a $1 billion contract to a railcar company called Kinki Sharyo, global Japanese-owned railcar manufacturer, and part of what they agreed to do was build a factory up in the Antelope Valley in Palmdale. And they had also agreed to work with a number of organizations and eventually a community benefits agreement. And when we started to monitor their job description says no people with criminal records. Just right on the job description, no, written off immediately, no consideration for anything. So we, worked with LA Metro, and we also organized pretty hard and pushed really hard back at them. Not only do you need to take that off, but you need to prioritize hiring people from Los Angeles and giving people a second chance. And I'm really excited to say that through a process of unionizing that workforce and working with Metro to force them to comply with their commitments, I think it's something like 20% of their workforce are people with records. And they actually now have a real program to give people training and help people, on retention. And that's something that a model we're now using with other companies. So I think that we can put our sights higher and demand that these big companies that are getting contracts actually have to consider and hire people from our communities.
Great, thanks. The second question I was going to ask Patrisse, but I think you actually dealt with it a little bit. Maybe you want to say a word more. There's a spiritual crisis in America. It's not just people coming from a system of incarceration with mental health issues and needing to get their spirit replenished. But just this last couple of days has spoken to the rot at the core of who we've been. But yet there's also some hope that people want to move to something better. Does that resonate with you? Does that make sense? It seems like so much of your work is about concrete politics, but also about art and culture and dealing with the spiritual crisis.
Yeah, I think we've been dealing with a spiritual crisis since the founding of this country. I think this is the first time, I don't know about y'all, but this is the first time I've heard white supremacy said on CNN ever. And the fact that we're finally we're being forced to have a different type of conversation, I think shows where our country is at. And I also think it's important for people to understand that the height of the KKK or neo-Nazi groups in this country has always been in times where Black people are building Reconstruction in their Reconstruction moments. And so if we understand history, this is history repeating itself. And so what we've seen in the last 4 years is a Black Renaissance. We've seen Black people say enough is enough. We've seen Black people and their allies be in the streets. We've seen whole cultural institutions, we've seen governmental institutions have to deal with its racism. And the underbelly of this country, which is what we saw in Charlottesville and what we're going to see in Boston this Saturday, and what we'll see in 33 cities across the country, September 9th, is white nationalists, white supremacist groups really holding on to an America that is actually changing before its eyes. And, I think many of us say although we're scared, I am scared in this moment. This is a scary time. I feel courageous and I feel brave. And I feel like although we're sitting in a really stale room, right? It's like it's not like a spiritual space to me. I do think
I teach a lot in this classroom. It's very spiritual when I do.
I'm glad you get to recreate it. But I do think, I just want to tap into the audience a bit. Like, this is our moment to be courageous, because and 30, 40, 50 years from now, you want to be able to tell your loved ones what you were doing in this moment. You want to be able to tell your family members, your children, or their children, or your grandchildren, that you showed up and you were on the right side of history.
Thank you. We have a range of just fantastic questions from the audience. So I'm going to throw a couple of them out, see who wants to pick up on this. Can we really do what we want on infrastructure if we don't overturn Prop 13? If you don't want to answer it, I will. But
I'll just say $130 billion is nothing to sneeze at. So we do have this tremendous opportunity, and let's do it right. I mean, we need to overturn Prop 13, but we need to not wait for that. We obviously just, we're taxing ourselves. That is pretty awesome that we're taxing ourselves. Now we need to do it right.
Angela Skinner.
I agree with that. We could do a lot more if we didn't have Prop 13. But we are not a poor country. We are not a poor state, and we need to stop acting like one. We need to stop acting like one.
The second question, which kind of I found fascinating, is about building power for change. And the question is about whether or not, how do you really make change at the local level bubble up to the state and to the national? And the person who wrote this question, who, by the way, does not have good handwriting, but it's a great question, said, are we islands of change, or are we incubators for a movement? So how do we really do the scaling?
We're definitely incubators for a movement, and I've seen some amazing examples of scaling up from things that are happening in local communities. One is around an issue that is an issue here, it's an issue every place where you have low-income communities of color, and that's the absence of access to fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly in black communities, but not exclusively in black communities. But when I'm traveling around the country, I know if I find an area where there's no grocery store, I'm in the black community. And, I don't have to have my eyes open to be able to see that. That is a problem that has been going on for decades. And in 2004, a local community came up with a solution. It's Philadelphia. Food First and the Reinvestment Fund, they started developing programs there. They thought they were on to something, and they took their idea to the state level. In 2004, Governor Rendell put $30 million in the economic stimulus package to get more fresh fruits and vegetables in underserved communities. In 2008, when President Obama got elected, PolicyLink, the Food Trust, and the Reinvestment Fund went to the Obama administration, multiple agencies, and said, here's a good idea. Why don't we get some money amassed at the federal level so we can start to have a national solution? And while it's still not enough, there's more than $1 billion on the streets, hundreds of projects around the country, thousands of jobs have been created, and millions of people now have neighborhood access to fresh fruits and vegetables that didn't have it before. That's an example of doing something locally, being able to tease it out and understand what are the principles, get them into a policy, and then with advocacy and strategy and resources, take it up. And I could give you a half dozen examples of things like that, easily.
Thank you. So I think for some folks that may hear me on different panels, I'm a little bit broken record around like process and being able to do things differently. And as I was hearing the question, I was actually imagining myself in the kitchen cooking with my mom and my sister. And when all three of us get in the kitchen, we have this amazing rhythm without having to sit down and plan out everything that we're going to do, right? And my mom, as a matriarch, doesn't say, like, I'm the boss, I've been doing all this, you guys are going to do everything. She steps back when either of us are going to be the lead on something, and we shift and move around each other and support each other in what we're doing. And how this builds up to, like, our movement is that at a local level is where we have more of the interaction with grassroots organizing, resident engagement. And then we engage at all the different levels with different partners that have different skill sets. And sometimes we get into rooms, small spaces like a galley kitchen, and we're elbowing each other because we're trying to say, my strategy is more important, or I've been here longer, or I know this more. So I think that to be able to build more on that, we have to learn how to engage in a different dance where we acknowledge and honor the different skill sets and opportunities across age, across generation, in order to be able to continue to build out the local, at the very neighborhood level, at the city level, regional, statewide, national, in order to be able to have that impact that people are asking about.
I just want to say that, I'm a person who's, I've spent my career working in Los Angeles and thinking that we could build Los Angeles a different way. The last few years have been working at the national level. And I just want to say, I firmly believe that we can build something amazing in Los Angeles, but we're in ideological warfare right now. And federal money hits every single agency and every single program that we fight for. Federal money is in school lunches, federal money is in the metro build-out, federal money is at the city level, at the state level. Huge portions are at the federal level. And if we don't get really smart and we don't really push our policymakers and our elected leaders to fight, and we don't give them the tools to fight, then we're going to have the Trump administration that's going to be telling us we can't do everything. So I'm just saying we can do a lot, but we need to be, and as we were just talking about, we need to be together, but we need to be prepared to fight back. So I don't think we can do it, and we cannot see ourselves as an island.
Great. I really love the idea of cooking together. One of my fondest memories is cooking with my dad and my son, and it was also effortless. There's very few parties at which you could shout, "Metro in the house, Metro in the house." But we actually do have Metro in the house. So, particularly for those of you from LA, as this build-out takes place, what do we need to make sure Metro knows and pays attention to? I think we're in an era where there's going to continue to be tensions and struggles. That's life. But where there's some open ears there for what we want to do, what do we really want to communicate? Isela?
For us, and I think they've definitely heard it from us before, as in many ways, being able to be a leader in transit that uplifts the importance of housing, affordable housing, deeply affordable housing is really, really critical. We have an opportunity right now with Measure M and the build out around the return of revenue to cities to really clarify and encourage and actually require that some of those resources be dedicated to affordable housing, because we know that housing is a regional crisis, not just in the city of LA. So being able to specify with the local return, being able to prioritize housing with that funding. I know for us at ACT LA, we'll be calling on the city of LA to at least dedicate 10% of that local return to housing and prioritizing the affordable housing preservation. So that's, I think, a very critical point with Measure M and this opportunity for those funds.
I'll say three things, and I think for Therese is the best of the best, and amazing leader. But I think three things. One is we have to create policies to make sure that we are creating good jobs, that we are creating opportunity for people who live in our communities to have those jobs, and we need to build that into the DNA of everything we do, everything Metro does. The second thing is I think it's okay to look at private money and bringing in private money, but we need public control. We cannot be, we voted to tax ourselves. We proudly voted to tax ourselves. We cannot be giving away control to private companies because maybe they're going to put a little money on the table. We cannot be privatizing. So we have to have in the DNA of what LA Metro does public control. And the final thing I'll say is, look, we're in a climate crisis. And as we build out a transportation system, we need to think about sustainability at every level. Equipment that we buy, the processes we use, climate resilience, all that needs to be built in. So I think those principles, good jobs, public control and sustainability, and I'm sure we'll have lots of healthy tensions with Metro over that.
So we're pretty close to the end. There's lots of questions here, but the speakers will be around for a few minutes afterwards. We built that in for you to ask individually. I want to give everyone 30 seconds for a sort of final thought you want to make sure you leave with the audience. I'll start at the end of the table with Angela.
Oh, so many thoughts. A final thought. I'm struck by the moment that we're in today. I agree with you. While this feels awful, this is an amazing moment and opportunity. All of the issues are on the table. The ugly side that often only gets talked about around the kitchen table in the Black community is being talked about on CNN, MSNBC, and every place else. That is a good thing. It is also a good thing that so many white people are stepping up and understanding that this is their moment to step up, and show that what they claim is in their hearts can activate their feet and their actions. And I'm seeing that happen. And the other thing that I think is that we're in such a moment of peril that all of us who have been working for social change recognize that we have to step up our ability to come together. If those things happen, I think that the angst that we're going through right now will fade in comparison to the strides that we will be able to make going forward.
Patrisse.
We have a real opportunity to try to fight back this jail plan. I think it was about 7 months ago, the County Board of Supervisors approved the $3.5 billion plan, meaning a women's jail and a mental health jail. They only have state funding for the women's jail, no funding for the mental health jail. And so I just want to plant that seed for folks who aren't part of that fight. If you're interested in joining the fight against the jail plan, come up to me afterwards so we can have a conversation around how your organization can be involved.
I wonder if Patrisse is an organizer.
What I would want to leave folks with, because I know sometimes being in the audience and hearing these things and like the opportunity for connection sometimes feels overwhelming, that we all have opportunities for interruption every day. And we all have opportunities to be able to change what we're hearing, what we're saying, how we're saying it, that help break down racism and discrimination in our communities for the future. So I think there's opportunities to plug in to be able to support changes in housing and infrastructure. We have a linkage fee coming up in the city of LA that folks can also connect up with. So it's not a lack of opportunities, but I think that we also have to see where on a day-to-day we can have those interruptions and be able to use our voice to change every single opportunity we have.
Madeline.
Sure. I also grew up near Canoga Park, but I grew up in the 60s near Canoga Park when LA was under Mayor Sam Yorty, and LA was a different place. LA was the center of open shop. I mean, in many ways, a similar place. You know, Daryl Gates, for how many years, was chief of police of the LAPD, and the city council was right wing. And LA was even more of an evil place. It was an evil place. Not to paint such a terrible picture, but I'm proud of how much my generation has fought to change LA and make LA this incredible place, and change the politics of California so dramatically. And I think, we need to kind of own that and be in the leadership of a powerful, courageous movement that challenges what's wrong and what's bad, and that holds ourselves accountable to having a strategy and to working together and to fighting in an intersectional way that creates common agenda. And I think we can do that.
This morning at the service for Heather Heyer, the young woman who was killed in Charlottesville, her mother was speaking, and she ended by saying, "I'd rather have my child, but if I can't have her, by golly, we're going to make it count." We need to make this moment count. And it's going to require shifting the conversation, because a lot of the conversation is going to be about growing a heart, being more kind and understanding with one another, dealing with our feelings. And we need to grow a heart. And I mentioned the spiritual issues that I think are important. But we also need to grow a spine. We need to get the organizing backbone. We need to get the social movement structures. We need to get the policies in place. And dare I say, research is a part of that. To be able to make some really concrete change to bring equity and infrastructure. Let's give a big hand for these sheroes of the movement. And before handing the mic to Laura or Laura, you don't need to, I did want to take a moment. Let's thank ACT LA and the ACT LA staff for all their hard work putting this together. And I also want to thank the USC PERE staff as well, Lauren Portillo Perez, Gladys Malabiran, who's live tweeting as we speak. Unisa Baladovic, can you raise your hand, who's our office manager? And then finally, Pamela Stevens, who puts together the data that I speak about and makes it seem like I'm intelligent. Let's thank Pamela as well. And thank all of you for your hard work for justice, for equity, for building a better Los Angeles, and scaling it up to build a better America. Thank you.